not the deck.
Alright, for the purpose of electronics, I think it's most helpful if we look at this from the standpoint of the three separate purposes that the electronics serve. So if you think about it, all of our electronics have three primary components. The first is your FCU, the second is your trigger board, and lastly we have the wire harness. Alright, so first of all, let's take a look at the FCU. Is the brain of the system. It tells the solenoid on the engine when to open and how long to open for, and that is governed by the rate of fire adjustment and the dwell adjustment. So dwell is how long the valve should stay open, which governs how much air is allowed into the engine. Rate of fire tells the solenoid how quickly to repeat the opening process. So if you're on a support gun, you're going to want to run higher rate of fire typically, and then if you're a spray and pray, you're going to want to turn it way up, but you may need to make some adjustments on your dwell because there are certain portions where you need to adjust your dwell to account for your rate of fire. I'm not going to go on all those little side notes and tangents on this video because we've covered that in previous videos, as well as the instruction manuals that you can find on our website at wolverineairsoft.com. Alright, so your rate of fire, again, tells the solenoid valve how quickly to open and close, and your dwell tells the solenoid valve how much air to allow through, if you will. Next we have our trigger board, and this is where things get a little complicated. So which trigger board you have is entirely dependent on what the base of your gun is, so what your gearbox configuration is. Do you have a V2? Do you have a V3? Or do you have something other, like this would be like your M249s. This would also include your TM M14s, and this would include any of the electronics systems that require our universal wiring kit, what we call the UWK. Again, I think this is most helpful if we take a look at it with the corresponding engine. So for the S&P, we launched in 2014 with two variations of the trigger board. Right here, you have the V2 trigger board that came with the S&P, and this is the V3 that came with the S&P. As you will note, the solenoid wire, the lead that goes from the trigger board to the solenoid, is soldered onto the PCB of the trigger board. I'm going to discuss basically why we changed from the soldered on configuration that we started with to the later iteration, which we now call our Gen 2. And again, I apologize, that may be a little confusing for some folks out there. You got a Gen 2 Inferno, but I have an S&P and it came with a Gen 2 electronic board. Well, that's correct, because our second generation electronics came out during the lifespan of the S&P. We noticed from the feedback we got from our users that these solenoid wires, if you wiggle them around a lot, can sometimes come off of the PCB. And as we're always trying to look at our designs and figure out ways that we can improve, one thing we considered was how do we make the trigger board design more robust for our end users. And that's really what the driving force behind our Gen 2 electronics trigger boards were. In spring of 2015, we went back to the drawing board and figured out a way we could make our trigger boards more robust. The answer to that was our Gen 2 trigger boards. So here's the V2 configuration and the V3 configuration. Now the main difference you see here is the absence of the solenoid wires, and we'll get to where those get to when we get to the section 3 on the wire harness. But for now, you'll notice that instead of a 5-pin connector, it now has a 3-pin connector. And aside from that, the functionality and the placement is very similar. But another thing we changed on the V2 board was we changed the flapper style selector switch to a fin style selector switch. Again, feedback that we got from our end users for a way to greatly improve the design there And so the answer was to use the fin style selector plate. Again, the functionality does this exact same thing. When you depress the trigger switch, it releases a BB. When you have your selector arm engaged and it's covering or engaging the selector switch, you're now in full auto. So as you can see, the Gen 2 electronic trigger boards are greatly simplified and thereby made more robust by the slight changes that we took. And again, we really value our end users' feedback. We develop products for you. We play some, but because we're designing and building engines and airsoft innovations for you, the users, we do value your feedback. So these are just some items here that you can see. We took your feedback and we went back to our drawing board and we listened to you and we decided, hey, we can make this better for our end users. Alright, so an important item to note is that we still use our Gen 2 iterations. The changes that we made, we discovered were solid enough that there's really hasn't been a need to update them. We've made some slight variations to, say, the shape of the PCB board, but as far as the actual functionality and the items used, there has been no significant change. So we still refer to this design as our Gen 2 V2 board and our Gen 2 V3 board. The SMP uses that. If you have a Gen 1 Inferno, you're still using that, whether it's for a V2 or a V3 configuration. And if you're using a Gen 2 engine or buy a new one, and we'll get into the differences between the electronic versions here in a minute, these are still the same trigger boards that are included in our premium electronics systems. So next we're going to talk about another trigger board that we introduced when we brought Hydra to the market. So now, since Hydra is using V6 and V7 gearboxes, the V2 and the V3 trigger boards no longer work for that configuration. So we're going to set those aside. So for Hydra, we have a couple different items. We have your TM trigger board for the TM M14 style. We found that this gun in particular was very tight, and for end user simplicity, we decided to develop a trigger board that would work specifically for that. You'll notice that it uses a 3-pin connector, just like the Gen 2 V2 and V3 boards, and then it uses the same style or pin style trigger that you see on the V3, as well as a pin style for the selector. And again, that's some semantics there, but that's basically what makes the TM trigger board separate. Next, we have our universal wiring kit. Now, if you had a Gen 1 Hydra and you didn't buy the TM M14 model, you most likely recognize this. This came with all the electronic components that are necessary for tying into your existing trigger board or your trigger mechanism on your V6 or V7 gun build. Alright, so at this point I think it's good to discuss the wire harnesses. I find it's most helpful to go back to when they were released. So with our SMP, we started out with two different variations. You had your V2, which is a 14-inch long wire harness, and you had your V3, which is a 12-inch. You'll notice that aside from the length, they are identical. They have 5-pin connectors on both sides, one of which plugs into your FCU. The other side plugs in to your Gen 1 V2 board or your Gen 1 V3 board. Now with the introduction to the Gen 2 trigger board design, we needed to also introduce a Gen 2 wire harness, because since there's 5-pin connectors on both ends of your wire harness, and now your Gen 2 only has a 3-pin connector, it just won't fit. So we developed a wire harness that came in the same 12 and 14-inch configurations as before, and this now plugs into your trigger board with a 3-pin connector, and then you'll notice that the two solenoid wires are now part of the wire harness. So just another way that we were able to simplify the design and make it a little more robust for you, the end user. Again, the Gen 2 wire harness comes in a 12-inch, a 14-inch, and an 18-inch model. They will function the same. You can operate a V3 with some of the longer ones, but just for configuration, space configurations, they come in different lengths specific to those gun builds. But functionality, obviously, there's 5 wires going through the wire harness, and your green and your yellow one will be going to your solenoid, and then your brown, black, and red control the trigger board. And then you do still have a 5-pin connector, which plugs into your FCU. So we're going to go back in time a little bit, by a couple months, to October of 2014. We also, in addition to the V2 and the V3 configurations, introduced the M249 wire harness. That introduced the possibility of plugging into your M249 trigger switch, and then it still had the solenoid wires attached like the later designs. If we have sold you, or you've bought, or you have a friend who has an M249 S&P or Inferno Gen 1 or Inferno Gen 2, it's going to come with this wire harness. So with the advent of the Bolt, it's the Wolverine Airsoft engine family, we introduced the Bolt wire harness, which allows for the operation of the Bolt engine without an FCU. So you plug your 7.4 volt LiPo battery directly into the wire harness, and the other end of the wire harness into the solenoid, and now you have a single switch that operates the valve. Alright, so hopefully now you have a good concept of the differences between the wire harnesses. All of our FCUs have a 5-pin connector on the base of them. For that reason, whether it's a Gen 1 or a Gen 2 version of our wire harness, it's going to have that same 5-pin connector. The opposite end then is the main difference, and so you're going to have a 5-pin connector on both sides. If you have that, you have one of the Gen 1 wire harnesses. If yours has the separate pigtail that goes out for the solenoid, that is going to be indicative that you have a Gen 2 style. And again, instead of a 5-pin like you have on the Gen 1, you have a 3-pin connector for the trigger board on the Gen 2. And then again, for Bolt, you have this all-in-one wire harness. It's actually kind of a 2-part. You have the little pigtail. All that does is it allows you to feed your Bolt engine down into your cylinder just for ease of installation. However, functionality-wise, it's just a continuation of the same 2 wires that go through the entire, from the battery all the way to the solenoid, and then you have the single switch that activates. So that's the Bolt wire harness. Alright, so now we're going to look at our FCU offerings. Again, your FCU, the brain of your system. So we have our premium FCU, and this operates basically all of our engines. It gives you a manual control of your rate of fire and your dwell settings, and it also offers you different menu modes that you can access. Again, I'm not going to go through all like the tutorial how-tos. I'm just doing a broad overview of the different electronics here, but if you want to be able to do 2-round burst, 3-round burst, 4-round burst, 5-round burst, semi-only, 2-second lockout if you're doing like a DMR mode at a mil-sim event, you can do all of those with your standard FCU. This was present for our Gen 1 trigger boards. It's still our premium FCU configuration. We've made some slight modifications, but for all intents and purposes, you get the same great functionality out of this one that you did from day one. With that, we have developed a M249 version, and so with your battery powered box mag, not for the ones that have like a microphone, but for your wired in, this is a version of the premium FCU, has a pigtail lead that goes to your box mag. It doesn't actually operate the box mag off the same battery as the FCU, but it sends a signal when you pull the trigger on your support weapon that tells the box mag, hey, start winding the motor. In the fall of 2015, we introduced our Bluetooth FCU. And the Bluetooth FCU, like the premium FCU, also has an M249 variation. But this one allows you to make modifications using our Android app on your Android smartphone that allows you to add in extra selector positions. You can have greater range of ability within your configuration of your weapon for personalization, customization. You can actually also do like a tournament lockout with this FCU. So again, I'm doing a broad overview here, trying to touch a lot of different bases. So I'm not going to go in depth on the demonstration of all the pros and cons of the FCUs compared to each other, but just know that you can find a video for this particular FCU on our YouTube channel. When we introduced Inferno Gen 1, with it, we also introduced our Spartan electronics. Now, what the Spartan electronics do is it greatly simplifies your electronics kit. Instead of having a separate wire harness and trigger board and FCU, you now have the combined trigger board and FCU on the Spartan, as well as the attached wire harness and selector wire lead. And with this, it allowed Wolverine Airsoft to offer to our users an incredibly robust system for entry-level users. And so this is what I use in my personal gun today. You can do semi, you can do 3-round burst, or you can do full auto. You're able to access, instead of having external knobs like you do on the premium FCU, everything is on board. So basically you can access the programming mode by plugging your battery in and then using your mechanical presets, if you will, your selector or your semi-auto position and your full auto position on your Airsoft V2 gun to access the menu. Again, not going to go into the demonstration today on that. Just want to let you know that's basically what the Spartan capabilities are. Now, if you want to do semi-only, or you want to do 2-second lockout, or you want to do 3-round, 4-round, 5-round bursts, you want to have more customization, then you're going to want to upgrade to the premium FCU or the Bluetooth FCU. Now, it should be noted here that all of our electronics are designed to be backwards compatible. So even though the Spartan board was introduced a year later with the Gen 1 Inferno, you can use a Spartan board on your SMP. And the reason for this is it's the same valve. All right, so hopefully now you have a good understanding of the differences between what we call Gen 1 and Gen 2 electronics, as well as our different FCU and wire harness and trigger board configurations. So again, your premium FCU has two main variations: the M249 version, which, by the way, can also be used in a standard gun. You would just have this extra pigtail coming off that doesn't need to be plugged into anything, and then your premium FCU here. Likewise, you have your Bluetooth FCU and the M249 variation of that. And again, these can be the brain of an SMP, they can be the brain of a Gen 1 Inferno or Hydra, or they could also operate the Gen 2 Inferno. And then you have the combined wire harness, trigger board, FCU capabilities of the Spartan board. Again, we call it the Spartan board because it's toned down a little bit. It only works in V2. It only has the capability of semi, 3-round burst, or full auto. So it's a little limited in that, but like I said, my gameplay is primarily semi shooter, so it does everything I need. And then if I want to, for kicks and giggles, to throw it into full auto, I have the ability to do that as well. Gen 1 wire harnesses, you have the V3, the V2, and the 18-inch models. So V3 is a 12-inch, your V2 is a 14-inch, and your 18-inch model would allow you to use either, but you'd be able to route for the FCU to be, say, forward in the stock or in a different location on your gun. All right, with the advent of our Gen 2 electronics, we introduced the V3, the V2, and the 18-inch wire harnesses for the Gen 2 trigger board variations. So again, you have your V2 and your V3. And about the same time, we also introduced the wire harness for the M249 configuration. And then lastly, when we introduced Hydra Gen 1, we introduced that with the TM trigger board as well as the universal wiring kit. I'll quickly run through. Basically, this was akin to having a premium V2 setup, but you now had a specific trigger board for your TM-M14 that would then plug into your Hydra directly and allow you to use your premium FCU. This was also available in the Bluetooth edition. And then for the universal wiring kit, there's a lot of different variations here because there's a lot of different capabilities, but basically, in short, you had the ability to use this jumper board for your wire harness, and then you had these two pigtail leads that you were able to plug in to the jumper board and route to the various points. Again, not going to go into that installation here, just wanted to give a broad overview of your electronic, our electronic offerings. So thanks for watching. This has been Jonny Cottrill with Wolverine Airsoft. If you have any other questions, again, hit us up on tech@wolverineairsoft.com, on Facebook, YouTube. What else are we on? Oh, if you haven't followed us on Instagram, check us out on Instagram. We like to do promotional giveaways and discounts from time to time. So if you follow us on Instagram, you'll be in the know. Again, we thank you for your support.